Pam was wrapping up her press conference when a reporter suddenly yelled from the crowd, "Did you manipulate the judge?" The entire room froze. Eyes locked. Cameras zoomed in. But instead of backing down, Pam smiled and set her notes aside. What she said next exposed a hidden agenda, turned the spotlight on the reporter herself, and triggered the most unexpected takedown live on air. Stay to the end, because this isn't just a mic drop. It's a masterclass in composure. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The press conference was nearly over, until it wasn't. Pam Bondi stood behind the podium, delivering her closing remarks on Florida's new state legal reform initiative. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, and for a brief moment, the room felt united in attention. "And with bipartisan support, we're ensuring equal access to representation," she said, voice measured, "because justice shouldn't depend on your zip code." "Pam, do you deny influencing that judge's decision?" The voice shot out from the second row like a firecracker in church. Reporters turned, heads snapped toward the source. Cassidy Price, a young liberal journalist known for her aggressive pieces, stood without waiting to be called on. Pam blinked, pausing mid-sentence. "As stated, I'll take questions after—" "You didn't answer it." Cassidy cut in louder this time, stepping forward slightly. "You say you care about fairness, but isn't it true you personally swayed the outcome of the Halpern ethics ruling?" The room shifted, tension thick as concrete. Pam inhaled slowly, pressing her palm flat against the podium. Her eyes scanned the room before resting on Cassidy. "Cassidy, as I said, questions come after the full statement." Cassidy didn't budge. "So, you're dodging. Got it." A murmur rippled through the crowd. A few journalists raised eyebrows. The moderator hesitated, half rising from his seat. Pam's smile was thin, controlled. "Are you here for facts or to go viral?" Cassidy's smirk answered that for her. Pam glanced at her notes, then did something unexpected. She slowly, deliberately set her stack of papers down on the podium. No rustle, no rush, just a calm shift in tone that made every person in the room sit up straighter. She looked directly at Cassidy. "If we're going there, then let's go there properly." A hush fell over the room. Even the sound crew stopped adjusting their levels. Cassidy tilted her chin up like she'd won something, but Pam's eyes said otherwise. She reached for the side of the podium, pulled out her phone, and added, "Because I've kept receipts, and you just gave me a reason to open them." Cassidy smirked like she just cracked open a scandal, but she didn't realize she'd only cracked open herself. Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly into the camera lens just inches from the podium and said, "Good. I hope you're all recording this." That simple sentence shifted the air in the room. Reporters glanced at one another. Pens slowed mid-sentence. The tension turned electric, because everyone knew what that meant. Pam was about to stop playing defense. "What she just implied," Pam continued, keeping her tone steady, "about judicial interference, that's defamatory, not provocative, not edgy, just reckless." Cassidy rolled her eyes with theatrical flair, scoffing loud enough for nearby mics to pick it up. "Oh, please. You're just uncomfortable being questioned." Pam didn't look at her. She stayed focused on the cameras. "Let's be clear," she said. "I've taken hard questions my entire career. What I won't tolerate is character assassination disguised as journalism." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Cassidy crossed her arms, doubling down. "So, you're going to dodge again. Not surprising." Pam finally turned her head. Her eyes locked with Cassidy's, sharp, unreadable. "No," she said softly. "Let's talk facts, not viral sound bites." A quiet ooh came from somewhere in the back. Cassidy shifted slightly in her seat, suddenly less comfortable. Pam took a slow step forward behind the podium, letting the pause build pressure. "You want to question integrity, Cassidy?" she asked, voice tightening just enough to cut. "Then let's talk about your last article. You remember it, the one your editor pulled before publication?" Cassidy's jaw twitched. The room leaned in. Some reporters glanced at their phones, already typing. "I know," Pam added, "because I got a copy of the retraction notice." Cassidy's voice faltered. "That has nothing to do with—" Pam raised her hand, calm and surgical. "It has everything to do with credibility, and if we're going to have a conversation about ethics, we'll have it on level ground." She leaned into the mic and added, "So, Cassidy, should we pull up the part where your piece was flagged for misinformation, or would you like to explain it yourself?" Cassidy's face dropped. Just for a second, the confident smirk faltered and her eyes darted around the room. She hadn't expected Pam to come locked, loaded, and ready to drag receipts live. Pam leaned in, calm, crisp. "I don't mind tough questions," she said. "I welcome them. But what I mind is lazy journalism with an agenda." The room murmured again. Even Cassidy's own cameraman adjusted his lens nervously. Cassidy straightened, snapping back. "That's rich coming from you." Pam didn't flinch. Instead, she pointed toward the press badge table beside the media row. "If we're going to talk qualifications, Cassidy, would you like to compare credentials now or later? Because I can pull yours up. Right here." She tapped her phone once, lifting it slightly as her screen glowed. Cassidy tensed. Her voice came out too fast. "You're deflecting." "No," Pam said. "I'm refusing to be cornered by someone whose last two pieces were flagged. One for bias, one for retraction." Gasps, quiet but audible. Several reporters started scrolling on their tablets. One whispered, "She's right. I remember that retraction." Cassidy shifted, now visibly flushed. That article had context. "And yet," Pam replied, tapping her screen again, "your editor removed it from syndication, didn't they?" Funny how facts get quiet when careers are on the line. The moderator half stood. "Let's keep this civil." Pam held up a hand. "Civility is what I've shown. Accountability is what I'm showing now." She turned back to Cassidy and added slow and sharp, "Your mic's still on, Cassidy. Even when you think no one's listening." Cassidy blinked. From the back of the room, someone whispered, "She's cooked." Pam looked out at the crowd. "We're in a time where public trust is fragile. If you want to be taken seriously, you don't get to selectively play journalist when it suits you." She held up her phone one last time and said, "Let's be honest. Public records are public for a reason. Shall I continue?" It started with a single voice from the back row. "Actually," a veteran journalist called out, lowering his notepad, "I remember that article. It was pulled without comment, 3 hours after it went live." Every head turned. Cassidy stiffened. Her smirk faded into a clenched jaw. "That has nothing to do with today," she snapped, voice pitched higher than before. "We're here to talk about her, not me." Pam didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her calm was a blade in silk. "On the contrary," she said, stepping away from the podium slightly, "credibility has everything to do with today, especially when you're the one trying to set the narrative." The air in the press room shifted like a tide turning. A younger reporter seated near the front glanced toward Cassidy's badge, then back at Pam. "She's got a point," he muttered to his colleague, not even trying to whisper. Cassidy looked to her cameraman as if for backup, but the man avoided her gaze, his hand still gripping the rig, suddenly unsure. Pam walked back behind the podium, opened her folder, and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "See," she said, unfolding it slowly, "I wasn't going to use this today. I really thought we'd stick to policy, reform, progress." She held up the paper between two fingers, just high enough for every camera to catch it. "But since we've pivoted into integrity and journalism," she said, tone razor sharp, "would you like me to read what your editor sent me?" Cassidy's lips parted, but no words came out. The veteran journalist sat straighter. Pam looked at the page, then back at Cassidy. "This email came 2 days after your piece was pulled. It starts with, 'Ms. Bondi, we regret the misrepresentation in the draft attributed to our reporter.'" Cassidy took a step forward, flustered. "That email was off record." Pam raised a brow. "You do realize your editor never marked it confidential, right? And I asked for permission to quote it. They said yes." Cassidy's hands curled into fists, shoulders rising. The rest of the room? Dead silent. But the shift was clear. The crowd had started listening differently now. Pam looked directly into the cameras and said, "So, Cassidy, would you like me to keep reading, or would you prefer to clarify it yourself?" Pam didn't wait for Cassidy's answer. Instead, she set the email down and turned back to the room. Her voice dropped, not in volume but in tone, more focused, more personal. "Since we're on the topic of what makes a good story," she said, "let's talk about the ones that didn't get told." Cameras locked on her. Cassidy froze mid-step. "Last month," Pam continued, "I represented a 19-year-old protester arrested outside City Hall. The charges were baseless, fabricated by a supervisor with a known bias against activist groups." She scanned the room. "The evidence was weak. The prosecution backed down. My client was cleared. A pause. But no one showed up to cover it. No cameras, no questions, no headlines. The silence in the press room was deafening. You know why? Pam asked, gaze sweeping across the rows of faces. Because it didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't sensational enough. It didn't get clicks. Cassidy shifted again, clearly flustered. You're just trying to spin. Pam turned to her, smiling politely. Oh, you want to talk spin? Good. Let's go there too. Cassidy blinked. Pam reached into her folder again, this time pulling out a crisp, stapled document. This is a list of political donations filed with the FEC, Pam said. It includes contributors to a media-aligned PAC that publicly weighed in on my ethics case. One reporter even covered it as if they were neutral. She held up the sheet. Guess whose name is on it? Cassidy's face paled slightly. Don't worry, Pam added. I've already highlighted it. The room erupted in low murmurs. Some reporters leaned over to glance at each other's screens. Phones tapped. Cameras zoomed. Cassidy's voice cracked. That's a personal donation. That doesn't mean anything. Pam's voice remained calm but colder. No, Cassidy. What it means is that while you were accusing me of bias, you were sitting in it. Cassidy turned toward her cameraman, who now looked visibly uncomfortable, lens drifting slightly downward. The weight of the moment shifted again. Pam didn't move, didn't blink. She just stood there holding the receipt, firm and fearless. She tapped the paper once and said, "Should I keep reading, or would you like to explain this yourself too?" Cassidy's face was beet red now, but it wasn't from righteous anger. It was the look of someone who realized the spotlight she craved had flipped around and was now burning hot. Pam held up the donation sheet again, this time letting the name hover just long enough for every camera in the room to zoom in. The bold font, the date, the contribution amount, it was all there. Turns out, Pam said coolly, Cassidy Price donated to a political action committee that publicly lobbied against judicial independence during the Halpern inquiry. Reporters leaned in. One audibly whispered, "No way." And yet, Pam continued, voice unwavering, she stood in this very room, pretending to cover that same case objectively. She called it journalism. I call it something else. Cassidy opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat moved like she wanted to speak, but nothing coherent followed, just a shaky exhale. Pam stepped forward, eyes locked on hers. I came here to talk about law, policy, real issues that affect real people, she said. But if we're going to air out bias today, Cassidy, I came prepared. Gasps rolled through the room like thunder. A reporter in the third row raised his hand, not for a question, but to show solidarity. The moderator tried to cut in, clearing his throat. Let's, stay on topic. We are, Pam said, not looking away from Cassidy. We're finally getting to the real topic, integrity in the people who claim to hold others accountable. Cassidy took a shaky step back. Her camera operator hesitated, glancing around the room. She turned toward him, desperate. Are you still recording? But he didn't answer. The room had shifted again, and this time no one was behind her. Pam took a slow breath, controlled, final. Cassidy, she said, voice sharp as glass, you've got 10 seconds to ask a real question, or I'm asking security to escort you out. The clock started ticking in the silence. Cassidy blinked, swallowed. But her next move wasn't what anyone expected. She reached for her phone and hit record, turning the camera on herself. If I'm going down, she whispered, I'm taking you with me. Cassidy's phone was still recording, held high like a shield. Her voice came back loud, shaky and defensive. You're trying to silence the press, she shouted, eyes wide with performative rage. Pam didn't move. She didn't blink. She let the room hold its breath for a beat before responding, calm as ever. No, she said, voice sharp and steady. I'm refusing to be baited by it. It was the tone, not the volume, that silenced Cassidy's outburst. And just like that, the power dynamic shifted again, this time without Pam lifting a finger. A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. A veteran reporter 2 rows back crossed his arms and muttered under his breath, She's got a point. Another nodded. Cassidy scanned the room looking for backup, but what she saw were stiff postures, averted eyes, and reporters leaning away instead of forward. Even her cameraman had lowered the rig, unsure whether to keep rolling. Cassidy's voice cracked again, louder now. You all see what she's doing, right? She's trying to control the narrative. Pam exhaled slowly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. No, Cassidy, I'm defending the right to speak without being slandered in my own press event. Security shifted near the double doors. One of the guards stepped slightly forward, just enough to make a statement. Cassidy saw it and panicked. She raised her phone higher. This is censorship. You're going to regret this. Pam turned toward the event moderator and gestured with one hand. Her voice wasn't raised, but it sliced through the tension like a judge's gavel. Is this a press conference or a circus? The moderator's lips parted, speechless. One of the security officers leaned into his radio and said, "We've got a disruption. Ready to move on your call." The moderator gave the smallest nod, and that was all security needed. Two guards moved forward, firm but calm, weaving through the rows of seated reporters. The quiet shift in the room was palpable. No one reached for Cassidy. Not yet, but the message was clear. Cassidy, sensing it, took a dramatic step backward and raised her phone high, recording herself now. "They're removing me!" she shouted into the lens, breathless like she was reporting from a war zone. "This is what censorship looks like in real time. Remember this face!" Pam didn't flinch. She simply tilted her head slightly and responded loud enough for the camera to hear. "Yes, they're removing you. For being disruptive. Not for being the press." The first guard reached her aisle. Cassidy turned to him like he was the villain in a courtroom drama. "Don't touch me. I have a right to be here." The guard held his hands out in front of him. "We're asking you to exit voluntarily, ma'am. That's all." She spun back to Pam, still recording. "This is a violation of my rights." Pam gave the smallest shake of her head, voice measured and pointed. "No, Cassidy. This is what happens when you confuse journalism with performance." The second guard now stood on her other side. Cassidy tried one last time, desperation bleeding into her voice. "You're proving my point." Pam stepped forward slightly. Her tone didn't rise, but her words carried weight. "No, I'm proving mine. This isn't censorship. It's called consequences. You don't get to hijack a press conference, slander someone live, and cry foul when the spotlight flips." The room was still, dead still. Even Cassidy's cameraman had stopped recording. With one final scoff, Cassidy turned toward the exit, storming down the aisle as the guards flanked her without laying a hand. Her phone stayed up the whole time, the red light blinking, live. The doors closed behind her with a heavy echoing thud. Inside, Pam turned back to the remaining reporters. "Now, who'd like to ask an actual question?" Outside, Cassidy's livestream pinged with thousands of viewers. Only the comments weren't praise. They were calling her out, loudly and mercilessly. Cassidy stood outside the venue, still streaming, chest rising with adrenaline. Her voice rang out to the camera, loud and defiant. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happens when you ask tough questions. I was escorted out for doing my job." But the comments weren't rolling in with support. They were flooding in like a tidal wave and turning against her fast. "You embarrassed yourself. That wasn't journalism. That was a tantrum." Pam stayed calm. "You spiraled." Cassidy blinked as the likes stalled and the angry emojis started pouring in. Her grip on the phone tightened. "You saw it happen. That was censorship, live." More comments hit the stream. "No, that was you getting checked. Pam gave you a chance. You wanted a scene." Imagine thinking chaos equals courage. Cassidy's expression faltered, just for a split second, before she ended the stream abruptly. Inside, the mood had completely shifted. Pam Bondi stood confidently at the podium again, surrounded by order, not chaos. The air had cleared. Reporters raised their hands professionally now, taking turns. Every answer Pam gave was poised, precise, and intentional. The clip of the confrontation had already been uploaded, edited down to a minute 30 of pure impact. Pam's now viral line, "This isn't censorship, it's consequences," was posted by a neutral legal journalist, and within an hour, it had racked up over 800,000 views. Even those who didn't normally side with her politics weighed in. One anchor tweeted, "I may not agree with Pam Bondi on everything, but her composure today, masterclass." Cassidy, meanwhile, stared at her phone backstage, frozen as comment after comment torched her credibility. Her mentions were on fire, and not in the way she hoped. The camera didn't catch her hands trembling, but her phone did buzz one final time. Unknown caller ID. Then a pause. Then a voicemail notification. She tapped it, breath held. Her editor's voice came through, cold and sharp. "Cassidy, we need to talk." Right now. Cassidy's screen flashed with an incoming call, this time from the legal department, and that's when she knew. This was bigger than bad optics. By sunrise, Cassidy's network was in full-blown panic mode. The clip of her outburst, Pam's takedown, and the press conference meltdown had hit 1.6 million views overnight. Major influencers had reposted it with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like," while media watchdog were already dissecting every second of the footage. Desperate to regain control, the network released an official statement by 9 a.m. "We are committed to journalistic integrity and are reviewing internal conduct. We support the right to ask tough questions while upholding professional standards." It was vague, safe, designed to calm the storm. It didn't work. Within the hour, users began pulling receipts. Screenshots of Cassidy's past retracted articles resurfaced. A deleted tweet where she'd called a politician too dangerous to deserve airtime was reposted hundreds of times. Hashtags like "Chalk Cassidy Collapse" and "Not Journalism" trended globally. One account shared a thread titled, "How Cassidy Price Went from Watchdog to Attack Dog." The most viral post of all, though? Pam's team released a single tweet with a quiet confidence that said everything without trying. "Truth doesn't fear the camera." And below it, a still image of Pam calmly setting down her papers, right before the mic drop. It exploded. Journalists from both sides of the aisle began commenting in support. Even networks that typically competed with Pam's critics chimed in, calling the moment a reckoning for modern media ethics. Meanwhile, inside the network's Manhattan headquarters, Cassidy sat in a glass-walled conference room, flanked by legal and HR. Her expression was unreadable. Her phone buzzed continuously in her lap, but she didn't dare look down. A senior executive finally entered, folder in hand. "Cassidy," he said plainly, "you're suspended, effective immediately, pending review." She opened her mouth, but no excuse came out. "And," he added, setting the folder down, "there's more." A staffer entered behind him, tablet in hand. On the screen, "Journalism Ethics Board opens formal investigation into Cassidy Price's conduct." Cassidy's breath caught. She looked at the headline, then at the silent room around her. And for the first time since the conference, she had nothing left to say. Outside the office, a junior producer whispered, "She thought she was breaking the story. Turns out she was the story." The set was minimalist. Black chairs, soft backlight, no audience. Just two cameras, a table, and the tension that came with truth on live television. Pam Bondi sat across from a seasoned national anchor, her posture composed, hands loosely clasped in her lap. The headlines were still fresh. Cassidy's suspension, the ethics probe, and the viral takedown clip that now had over 4.3 million views. But Pam wasn't here to gloat. She was here to clarify. The anchor leaned in. "Some say this was personal, that you dismantled a journalist to protect your own image." Pam didn't blink. Then they weren't watching closely. She leaned forward, her tone measured but unshakable. "I'm not anti-press. I'm anti-smear. There's a difference." The camera zoomed slightly, capturing the weight behind her words. "I've spent years fielding hard questions, and I'll always stand in front of a mic. But what I won't do is stay silent when I'm turned into a caricature for clicks." The anchor nodded slowly. "So what would you say to Cassidy Price directly?" Pam took a breath, eyes steady on the lens. "Ask me anything. Challenge me. Debate me. Just don't twist the question to fit a story you wrote before I ever opened my mouth." The silence in the studio said more than applause ever could. Online, the interview began trending before it even ended. Clips were clipped, quotes were tweeted, and Pam's statement, "You can't cancel someone who's already faced worse," became a digital anthem. Viewers flooded the comment sections. She didn't dodge. She didn't snap. She just spoke like a grown-up. Refreshing. Finally, someone who pushes back without playing victim. And then the final ripple hit. A viral poll launched under the network's own tweet. Should Cassidy Price be allowed back on air? Within minutes, tens of thousands voted. The numbers weren't even close. Pam leaned back in her chair, the lights dimming slightly for the end credits. The anchor turned to her with a wry smile. "Well, that was fair," Pam smirked. "That's all I ever asked for." Backstage, a producer whispered into a headset, "Phones are lighting up. Viewers want her back." And Cassidy gone for good. 3 weeks later, the press room looked the same, but the energy was different. There were still cameras, still rows of reporters, still the soft hum of broadcast equipment warming up. But this time, no one interrupted. No one shouted from the second row. And one seat, once filled with fiery ambition, sat empty. Cassidy Price's press badge had been revoked, quietly, officially, permanently. Pam Bondi stepped onto the stage with calm authority, dressed in navy blue, her signature gold cross resting just above her collar. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was respectful. She approached the podium, nodded to the moderator, and smiled at the crowd. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying effortlessly. "I'm here to talk about accountability, real accountability, not the kind that goes viral, but the kind that actually changes things." The room leaned in. Pam recapped her latest legal initiative, answered questions about policy, and addressed criticism without deflecting it. A journalist from a progressive outlet asked about racial disparities in court rulings. Pam didn't dodge. "I've seen the data," she said. "It's real. And if we ignore that, we're complicit in it. Justice doesn't bend unless we force it to." That got a few nods, even from her skeptics. She moved through each topic with grace, correcting misinformation with facts and challenging assumptions with clarity. The room stayed professional, but alert. There was no ambush, no shouting, just tough, necessary dialogue. As she approached her final statement, Pam paused, hands resting lightly on the podium. "There's one thing I hope we all take from what's happened these past few weeks," she said, scanning the room. "It's this. Holding power accountable is critical, but that includes your own." A hush fell. No one moved, no one dared. Pam smiled, not smug, not superior, just certain. She stepped back slightly and added, "Now, are there any actual questions?" A beat of silence. Then a hand went up, front row. It belonged to a young reporter, no older than 24. Nervous but steady, she stood. "I'm here to ask," she said softly, "not accuse." Pam's face softened instantly. She stepped down from the podium, walked over, and extended a hand. "Then let's talk." The entire room rose to its feet. Standing ovation. No cheers. Just the kind of applause that means we saw you. We heard you. We're better for it. As the lights dimmed and the cameras cut, one mic remained hot, just long enough to catch Pam's final whisper. "This time, we set the tone."